Hi, my name's Wendy Chung. I'm one of the investigators in the Simons VIP study, and I'm so glad you had some time to spend with us today. For the next few minutes, we're going to be going over some of the information we presented in the summer 2015 family meeting about the 1q21 deletion and duplication. As you're going to be seeing, we've collected these data through studies that we've done with the generous contribution of our families, taking the time and energy to help us learn more about this particular condition so we can share this information with you today. When we started the Simons VIP study about 5 years ago, we did it with the intention of being able to understand better some of the chromosome disorders that are associated with autism. As we did this, we were interested in being able to work with families to provide them with information that they were going to find helpful in terms of taking care of their children and their families. And as we were doing this, we were interested in understanding better how the brain works and being able to understand how it's related to behavior, in particular behaviors related to autism. So as we've done this, we've gone about collecting information about some of the medical challenges as well as some of the issues related to what we call cognition, or how the brain works, as well as how the brain functions in terms of controlling aspects of behavior and the body, and in particular, understanding how some of this changes over time. In particular, we were curious about how children at young ages develop with some of these genetic differences, hoping that there might be an opportunity in terms of intervention. And so you'll also see that we're going to be talking about some things that are related across the life course with this. Let me start by briefly describing and orienting you to the region that we're talking about. We're talking about a region on chromosome number 1, on what we call the long arm or the Q arm. And the address of 1q21 tells us exactly which region we're talking about so that we don't get this confused with other regions on chromosome 1. In particular, I wanted to just let the families know that there is another region also on chromosome 1 that's called the TAR region. And as you're talking with some of the other families that may be on Facebook or other groups, it's sometimes confusing because they both go by the same sort of zip code, if you will, of 1q21, but they're slightly different blocks, city blocks within the zip code that account for the two different regions, and there are some different challenges for the two different deletion syndromes. And so just a word of warning that as you hear about this, if you're ever concerned about whether or not you're in the right club, please talk with the genetic counselors at Simons VIP, and they'll make sure that you're actually in the group of 1q21 that we're going to be talking about today. So just to explain a little bit further, when we think about chromosome 1, all of us have 2 copies of chromosome 1, one that we received from our mother and one that we received from our father. In particular, when you think about individuals with the 1q21, either the deletion or duplication, when they go to have children, they can either pass on the chromosome 1 that's normal and intact, or they can pass on the copy of chromosome 1 that has either the deletion or duplication. As a consequence of that, there is a 50-50 chance of passing down this particular genetic difference every time someone with this has a child. And so that's something that sometimes parents ask us about, and that if you have other questions, you can certainly talk to your genetic counselor or any of your other doctors to get some further information. Despite the fact that I talked about this being passed down to one's children, it is also possible, and I know this sounds somewhat contradictory, but it is also possible that the 1q21 deletion or duplication in your child may have arisen what we call de novo, or in other words, that it was brand new and started first with the child, as I've shown the child here with the sort of rays of light around them, started first with that child as a new genetic change that was not inherited from either the mother or the father. And that certainly is sometimes the case. We know that this particular region of our genetic information is somewhat unstable, and so sometimes copies can either be deleted or extra copies can put in. On the other hand, once someone has either the deletion or duplication, even if it was not in the prior generation inherited by them, they can still pass it down on to the next generation. So the information I'm going to tell you about today is specifically a consequence or a product of the Simons VIP study, where individuals went to one of our 3 clinical sites, either in Boston at Boston Children's Hospital, down in Texas, in Houston at Texas Children's Hospital, or out west at the University of Washington in Seattle. I first want to start by thanking the families for really their incredibly generous contribution. The families who participated in this study often took 2 days at these clinical sites being evaluated, with lots of time to travel to get there and go home. And they've really done a great service to all of the other families who are listening to be able to provide this information that can be shared. When the families went to the clinical sites, some of the things that we did were to collect information in terms of medical history information, as well as reviewing medical records to be sure that we had the story straight, that all the facts were correct, and that we had all the technical terminology correct. And as they were at clinical sites, were evaluated by neurologists in particular that also reviewed medical records related to neurology to make sure that we had all the information correct. And the individuals were also evaluated by psychologists who spent a lot of time with the families getting to understand how their brains were working, being able to administer some very detailed tests about everything from IQ or intelligence quotient to also things like behaviors such as autism. And again, these were very detailed studies that often took a lot of patience to be able to complete. In addition, some of the families also had imaging done of their brains, so in other words, magnetic resonance imaging or MRIs to be able to look inside at their brains and to see if there were any things to be concerned about. And the good news about that is, in fact, that wasn't an issue. So in the next slides, I'm going to tell you about some of the information that we learned. And as I'm going through the next 3 slides, I want you to realize that you only have to pay attention to about half of the information. So what I mean by that is that you'll see in this slide, for instance, that there are rows for deletion carriers as well as duplication carriers, and you really only have to pay attention to that row that's specific to you. So in other words, if there's a deletion in your family, only pay attention to the information about deletions, or if there's a duplication in your family, only pay attention to the information about duplications because the other part isn't necessarily pertinent to your family. Within both the deletion and duplication families, we had some very generous family members who carry neither the deletion nor the duplication who were willing to serve as comparators. So what I mean by that is both children and adults who were able to represent individuals for comparison who did not have the same genetic change and who allowed us to see sort of how our tests were performing on normal individuals. Within this table, what you'll see is that both for deletions and duplications, we had a nice range of both children and adults in both cases, split approximately half and half. But I want to emphasize that the numbers that we were able to study are still somewhat limited. So by that I mean that these numbers are based on approximately 20 individuals in each group, only about 10 children and 10 adults. So please appreciate and realize that as we're providing you with this information, that these are based on small numbers and that there could be variability within your family in terms of not matching up exactly with what we saw in these other families. In addition, I want to draw your attention to the mean age, the column over all the way on the right, or the average age, which shows us that for the children with either the deletions or duplications, that they were still, on average, relatively younger. In other words, in first or second grade, these children were not, for instance, teenagers for the most part. I'm going to now focus on really the medical aspects that were related to either the 1q21 deletion or duplication individuals, and realize again that the numbers that I'm talking about now are for the younger individuals, and they tended to be even more limited in terms of only 11 or 12 individuals per group. And so again, realize that some of the things I'm reporting to you were reported by a single participant within the study. I'm going to start by talking about the deletion carriers. This is the middle column for those of you who have families with the deletion. Some of the things to realize is that overall, what I would say is that there were not significant health challenges with very few exceptions. So in general, what I mean by that is individuals were generally healthy. There were a few, what I would say, relatively minor issues, but overall people tended to be healthy, and that for the most part, the things that we were seeing within the first few years of life were the things upon which we had to focus. So in other words, not a lot of things were continuing to come up over time. They were things that we tended to see in the younger children, and they were just continued issues. One of the important things to realize is that we did see problems with the eyes, in particular problems with cataracts. I think those are important to know about in terms of getting the eyes checked, because it's very easy to remove cataracts should they ever be an issue. And so I think that's helpful information for families to make sure they're getting regular eye checks. And the cataracts tended not to be there at birth, but things that came up over time. In addition, we did see some issues that were related to problems with growth. About halfway down, you'll see that about half of our individuals with the deletion were on the shorter side. I think this is important to know in terms of setting expectations, because when your children go to the pediatrician, they're always measuring height and weight to see if they're growing as to be expected. And I just want you to have realistic expectations that the children do, on average, are on the shorter side. And this is basically because their bodies are programmed to grow in a slightly different way, that is to be a little bit shorter than other children. In other words, I don't want you to go nuts or get overly concerned if your child isn't right at the 50th percentile on those growth charts. It's very likely that if they're running at more the 5th or the 10th percentile, that this is just fine for this particular condition. There were some issues that we saw in terms of some other endocrinological issues, and some of the doctors that are specialized in this are called endocrinologists. We did see, for instance, hypothyroidism. This is something that every newborn baby is tested for. So at least if you didn't get a call about this at birth, it was okay when your baby was born, but it can be something that does come up over time. In addition, there were some problems. Again, these are small numbers, but we had one adult with problems with infertility and a second individual with problems with diabetes or blood sugar problems. So something for an internist, especially a family health doctor or a primary care doctor, to keep an eye on for individuals as they're getting older. There were also some relatively infrequent problems with the intestinal tract. These include inflammatory bowel disease as well as gastric ulcer. Again, they weren't very common, but we did see them occasionally. And as well, there were sometimes issues, again, not very frequent, but problems with recurrent infections that generally tended to be self-limited in the sense that they didn't require hospitalization, but did include things like more frequent colds or pneumonias or ear infections. In addition, there were infrequent problems with the bones. We had one individual with scoliosis or curvature of the spine, as well as one individual who had a condition called craniosynostosis, the big word, but what it means is that the bones in the skull were fused and had to have surgery to correct them. Let me switch over now to families in the duplication category. Again, looking through some of the same categories in our families with duplications, there are some challenges that are the same that I just mentioned, but some that are a little bit different. One of the challenges that's very similar were problems with growth, with individuals tending to be on the shorter side, as well as problems with curvature of the spine or scoliosis. So about a third of our families, or our participants, I should say, had problems in one or the other of those areas. In addition, there were some intestinal problems, and these included three conditions: celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease, as well as gastric ulcers. And so for individuals who seem to be having problems in terms of abdominal pain, problems in terms of intolerance to certain diets, or having problems with diarrhea, it is something good to bring up with your doctor to see if any of these could be the problem, especially because there is treatment that is available, and you'll want to make sure that you're getting the right treatment. In addition, there were a small number of birth defects. These included things like heart problems, as well as a hole in the roof of the mouth. Again, these are not very common problems. And again, if they're not present at birth, congenital heart disease specifically, or cleft palate, or a hole in the roof of the mouth, if these are not present at birth, they will not arise later. And so that's something that you can, if your pediatrician has already looked at, you don't need to continue looking for that. Similarly, in this next slide, to continue the discussion, the deletion families are in the middle column, and the duplication families are on the right column. One of the things that we saw relatively frequently with the deletion carriers were things related to the brain, not surprisingly perhaps with the way I started our discussion. In particular, we know that approximately 20 to 25% of individuals had relatively small head sizes, or what we call microcephaly. This is something that, again, should not cause undue consternation in the sense that we know this is an inherent portion of 1q21, but it's something that pediatricians often check. So just to let you know that and not be surprised if it comes up. In addition, as the neurologists either did examinations of participants or as they reviewed records, we saw some common neurological or brain features. One was that muscle tone tended to be on the lower side, or hypotonia. We also saw some behaviors that were included tics or Tourette syndrome, as well as problems with epilepsy in approximately 18%. And some, I would say they weren't clinically that concerning, but they did see some differences in terms of nerves that work with different parts of the face and the head. Switching gears now, when we're talking about individuals with the duplication, again, there are some similarities with the deletion carriers, although overall I would say there were less significant effects in terms of effects on brain and behavior. Muscle tone was low in about 15% of those individuals, along with one individual who also had muscle weakness. And in contrast to the deletion carriers, the duplication carriers tended to have larger head sizes. Again, this doesn't mean any problems necessarily with hydrocephalus or water on the brain. And again, I think it's helpful to know so that as your pediatrician is measuring head size, if it measures on the head size, not to get overly concerned about that. Let me now go on to just say that as we have been going through the Simon's VIP study, we have entered into a new phase, or phase 2 of this study. We now have opened up the opportunity for families to be able to participate remotely. We realized that it was quite a hardship for some families to be able to get to a clinical site, to be able to give up that much time from their vacation or their work, to be able to get these studies done. And so we wanted to have an easier way for families to be able to participate and to be able to make the numbers that we're talking about larger. That is, to make sure that we had larger numbers of participants so that we could get you more accurate data about the frequency of some of these challenges, and to be able to have a better sense of how things might be changing over time. And that having online ability for families to deposit or provide data allowed us to continue following some of these individuals over a longer period of time. So many more families have been participating in phase 2, and I'd encourage any of you who haven't already to go online at Simon's VIP Connect and to be able to sign up if you're willing. With this, one of the Genetic counselor coordinators will be working with you on the telephone to be able to find out more about the medical history, as well as for you to be able to fill out questionnaires online, and then to be able to compare, in many cases, how your family is doing to many of the other families. We're hoping that over time, as we do this, it'll give us more robust and reliable estimates of the frequency or how often certain things happen, and we hope that this is going to be helpful to the larger community. I will also say that if there are things that you've heard through this webinar that you're wondering about or have very specific questions, we have an Ask the Expert option online. So you can go to simonsvipconnect.org and be able to look at the Ask the Expert button and send questions in, and we'll make sure that those are either answered by myself or by one of the other doctors or genetic counselors who can be able to provide you with the best perhaps more specific information in your family. I want to take a second to acknowledge all of the many investigators and researchers who allowed us to be able to give you this information, both from my webinar as well as from the other webinars from the family meetings. It's been really a terrific group of folks that are scattered around the country, all different types of doctors and psychologists and researchers, who include everything from geneticists to neurologists to pediatricians to radiologists and psychologists who are really truly dedicated to being able to understand 1q21 better and to be able to work with you so that we can provide more information that will be helpful for your family to prepare, anticipate, and hopefully to minimize any of the burdens that might come with this particular genetic condition. So we appreciate hearing back from you. We hope that we're going to be able to give you more and more updates with this information over time as we have information that we've been able to thoroughly evaluate and make sure is correct to be able to give that back to you. So thank you for your time today, and look forward to hearing from you and interacting in the future. Bye-bye.